Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show, only on GB News. Joining me now is the former head of MI6, Sir Richard Dearlove. Lovely to see you this morning, Sir Richard. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll get on to Russia in just a moment, but can we talk about this ICC arrest warrant? Joe Biden, the US president, has called the ruling outrageous and pledged to always stand with Israel against threats to its security. Senator Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican, has said to any ally, Canada, Britain, Germany, France, if you try to help the ICC, we're going to sanction you. We should crush your economy. Do we think the UK government should be siding with the ICC or with Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think in this particular instance, there's no question we have to side with the Israelis. Look, the situation is extraordinary. In a war, you try to protect your civilian populations. Hamas's strategy is to make sure that the maximum number of Palestinians are killed. It's going completely reverse to what one would expect. It's actually got massive underground tunnels under Gaza. It could protect the civilian population by putting them in its own air raid shelters. Does it allow the Palestinians to go into the tunnels? Absolutely it doesn't. But there's no question that the whole thing is a setup, as it were, to propagandize the conflict and to make Israel look like, the extremists. I mean, Israel are fighting a war of survival. And I mean, what this means is that the ICC would condemn any leader in a nation that's fighting a war of survival. I think it is a black and white situation. It's confused by the level of humanitarian suffering, which is dreadful. But on the other hand, this is what Hamas is trying to do.
Do you think that there's a sense to which some people in the Western world have completely underestimated what Hamas are and the threat they pose, not just to Israel, but actually the rest of the world, not least with their Iranian backing? There's this sense to which it seems as if Hamas has won at least the propaganda war online. Do people actually have any comprehension at all of just how barbaric and brutal these people are?
No, I don't think they do. And I think this is what's so catastrophic. I mean, the Iranian theocracy, through its Praetorian Guard, the IRGC, has, as it were, prepared the ground over years with Hezbollah, with Hamas in particular, to an extent with the Houthi as well. And I think when you see these demonstrations in sympathy with the Palestinians, that I understand. But support for Hamas and support for Hezbollah means that people just do not understand the reality of the situation. These are ruthless, bloody terrorist organizations.
Should Home Secretary Yvette Cooper be being far less ambivalent about this? Should she just come out and say, no, we're not going to abide by any ICC arrest warrant because Israel is a democratic nation?
Well, she certainly should. But having heard her interviewed on the Today programme earlier in the week, she clearly hadn't a clue what to say. She ducked and weaved. I mean, it was the most extraordinary. She just blared her way through the interview without really saying anything. I mean, it shows that they're in a very tough position, but they need to take a clear stand on this.
But that's really worrying. I mean, you're a former head of MI6. Aren't you quite worried that the Home Secretary, quotes, doesn't know what to say in an interview?
Look, I'm deeply worried about aspects of this new government, particularly when it comes to national security. And these are ultimately issues of national security.
Well, develop that thought. What worries you most?
Well, I think what I'm really concerned about is the defence budget. We're in a state of international crisis. OK, we have a defence review, but there's no urgency at all on the government's part. We've just seen them cut various military equipment to make a saving. OK, they're saying it's outdated, but you don't do that when you are threatened by probably the worst security situation in Europe. Look, for someone like me, I mean, this may upset a lot of people. This is as important, perhaps more important than the National Health Service. It should be absolutely at the top of the government's priorities, and it isn't. And I mean, this also bleeds into our energy policy, and because that's a vital part of national security. And you've got Ed Miliband following a completely crazy energy policy. I mean, mad energy policy.
What are you saying, that you think it plays into the Russians in many respects and the Chinese?
Well,
what are you saying about that, Sir Richard?
we have our own energy resources. We need to develop our independence. We should, I'm afraid, be thinking about things like fracking. We should be thinking about, how we're going to maintain cheap energy supplies for ourselves on the basis of the resources that we own and control. Look, this is a complicated issue, but I think we need to be pretty clear-cut and simple about it.
Let's try and be clear-cut and simple about Vladimir Putin. Should we be more worried about hypersonic missiles, or should we be more worried about cybersecurity and attacks on our key infrastructure?
Well, I think Putin's got a problem. He can escalate the war verbally, which he does, but then to escalate it in terms of conflict is a more complicated issue. I think he wants to avoid a shooting war with the West, but he's prepared to make these demonstrations of Russian armaments and Russian armaments technology. But in reality, I think what we're facing already, we're in a state of hybrid conflict with Russia. So there are many things that he's going to do to us without really much restraint. We've already been warned by the heads of the security service and the intelligence service about Russian sabotage and the Russians going feral in this area. We've seen cables being cut internationally. We've seen problems with critical infrastructure. We have seen cyber-related. You probably know my personal emails have been hacked by the Russians several times, and that's caused quite a lot of publicity. I'm very flattered that they still want to hack my emails, but it shows the extent of the lengths that they're prepared to go to. And then there's the whole area of information warfare, cognitive warfare, in which the Russians are highly skilled. So all of these things are going to escalate. I don't think Russia is going to risk personally a shooting war with the West. If they can't cope with the Ukrainian military, if they can't win in Ukraine, they're not going to take on NATO. But we're already in a state of conflict in all these other areas. And, the Marxist doctrine to which Putin still subscribes is that all of these areas are areas of conflict. The military is just one dimension.
How worried were you when we discovered that North Korean troops were being sent to Ukraine? It just kind of conjures up, I think, this resurgence of the idea of an axis of evil being formed.
Yeah, I think that we have to see that that's a real issue. Iran, Russia, China, North Korea working together. I'm actually skeptical about the value of North Korean troops to the Russian military. It seems to me that this is almost a symbolic move. And I was recently at a security conference in Central Europe last week, at which Ukrainians were present. And I think they agreed with me that the integration of North Korean soldiers into the Russian military is not a straightforward issue. And how effective are they going to be on the battlefield? These people have been completely isolated. They're part of an autistic regime. They've never been outside North Korea. They don't really know anything about the outside world. Are they going to defect? How are they going to behave on the battlefield when they face a really fierce, battle-hardened Ukrainian military? For me, this is more of a symbolic gesture than a military gesture.
What are your thoughts about the re-election as US President of Donald Trump? Do you think that ultimately will make the world a safer place or more dangerous when you consider some of his rhetoric, particularly around Ukraine and Russia?
We don't know is the answer. With regard to China, Biden followed the policy that Trump established in his first administration. I have to admit, I'm worried about Trump in relation to Ukraine, but talking to other members of his administration, I've certainly done podcasts with Rubio, who's now his Secretary of State. Rubio makes the point very clearly that Trump is not going to start his administration with a disaster in Ukraine like Biden in Afghanistan. This dogged Biden for the whole of his administration. So I think it's important to sort of leave the book open and consider where we stand. The irony is, if you take the UK on its own, Trump has a much better disposition towards the UK than Biden ever had. The first thing that Biden did when he came into it was to suspend trade negotiations, which never returned. Biden looks on this country with much more friendship. Trump looks on this country with much friendship with Biden does. So, you know, I mean, look, there's uncertainty. We don't have all the answers, and I'm worried about some of the people he's trying to appoint. But I think, you know, this will clarify over time. And he's the democratically elected president of the United States with a clear mandate. The special relationship thrived under his previous administration, so there's no reason to panic at this stage.
Although he probably won't have the best relationship with David Lammy, the foreign secretary, who has been hugely critical of Trump.
Oh, lots of people have been critical about Trump. And let's face it, when foreign secretaries go to Washington, and I know this in my own experience, they don't necessarily see the president. And I'm not sure, you know, Lammy is going to be best friends with him. I mean, other people do. And there'll be other people who'll be interlocutors with Trump. And anyway, look, Vance was pretty rude about Trump in his previous political life. But, you know, Lammy has got a lot of baggage, and, yeah, he's not the ideal person. But he won't be, he'll be part of the special relationship, but in my guess, he won't be a particularly important part of it.
I know, but I am intrigued, Sir Richard, because you've expressed concerns now about the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, two key politicians representing Great Britain on the world stage. Well, look at their records since they came into office. You know, they had everything going for them, and they've just made a series of extraordinary mistakes. My other question is, why on earth is the Prime Minister jumping off aeroplanes all the time? He's got domestic problems to deal with. When Margaret Thatcher came into office, first of all, she refused to travel overseas. She was criticised for it, but it was exactly the right thing to do. She focused on the domestic agenda. The Prime Minister doesn't need to be running around the world in this crazy fashion. How many trips has he made since he came into power? This is ridiculous. Well, I don't know. All I know is he's been nicknamed Never Hear Keir. Sir Richard Dearlove, thank you very much for your candour this morning. Great to speak to you, albeit rather troubling times ahead, I think, for the West. Thank you.